He thought he was only driving his sister to the animal shelter. A quick errand on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of favor that costs nothing and asks nothing in return. He was wrong about both. Graham Telfer pulled his truck into the parking lot of the Squamish Animal Rescue Society just after 9, the Tantalus Range lost behind low cloud, snowmelt running in cold threads down the windshield. At 53, Graham was the kind of man who moved through public spaces the way a ship's keel moved through water. Quiet, deliberate, making no unnecessary wake. His younger sister, Diane, 47, had asked him to drive because her car was in the shop and because she had learned, over a lifetime, that asking Graham for a favor was the only reliable way to get him out of the house. Diane worked part-time at the Squamish Public Library and volunteered at a small seniors center on Thursday afternoons. She was the kind of woman who remembered the names of people's dogs and their children both, and who had the particular stubbornness of a person who refused to give up on anyone, including her brother. Graham had retired from the Royal Canadian Navy 6 years ago, after a career that included 2 tours with Joint Task Force 2 and a set of experiences he never described in detail to anyone who asked. Since then, he had built his life in controlled, deliberate layers: a log house on the edge of a Douglas fir ridge above the valley, contract work doing perimeter security checks at the Squamish grain terminal 3 nights a week, black coffee, locked cupboards, and a silence he had been calling peace. For so long he had almost stopped noticing it wasn't. His wife Rebecca had died 18 months ago, pancreatic cancer, 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He had not spoken her name aloud since February. Diane did not push. She brought casserole dishes and left them on the porch. She texted. She showed up. She knew the difference between what her brother needed and what he thought he needed, and she was wise enough to move around the gap carefully, rather than try to fill it with noise. The shelter smelled of disinfectant and kibble and something underneath both of those. The specific, anxious hope of animals waiting to be chosen. Graham stood near the entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets, while Diane signed the paperwork for a 3-legged tabby cat. She had already named without consulting anyone. He was not planning to look at the dogs. A shelter volunteer in a green vest opened a low side gate, and 2 German Shepherd mix puppies spilled into the corridor. They were 8 weeks old and had absolutely no idea. The first one, black and tan, with ears too large for his head and a belly that suggested he had never missed a meal despite being found under a highway overpass, spotted Graham from 6 feet away and made a decision. He crossed the distance at a gallop, skidded on the linoleum, caught himself, and immediately seized the cuff of Graham's work boot in his teeth. He shook it with the conviction of a creature who had decided this was his life's calling. Graham looked down at him. The puppy released the cuff, sneezed, looked up as if to confirm the boot was still there, and seized it again. Diane watched from the counter with the expression of a woman holding back the full force of something delightful. "He chose you in about 4 seconds," she said. "He chose my boot." Flattering either way. Graham did not smile almost. He was practiced at almost. The second puppy had not moved. He stood at the far end of the corridor near the kennel wall, smaller, darker, the tan markings on his legs and muzzle faded to near gray. His ears were half raised. His amber eyes moved steadily around the room in a slow, deliberate arc. The exit, the stranger, the gate, the floor. He was not cowering. He was not shaking. He was simply reading every variable in the space the way someone reads a contract before signing anything. Graham's chest did something unexpected. A woman stepped out from the side office. She carried a clipboard against one arm and introduced herself without preamble. Celia Park, shelter coordinator, mid-30s, dark hair in a loose knot, the kind of calm in her expression that came from spending years kneeling beside frightened animals and learning to mean it. "The social one is Hatch," she said. "He has a gift for attachment and absolutely no sense of self-preservation." Hatch had now flipped entirely onto his back and was attacking Graham's bootlace from below. "And the other one?" Graham asked. Celia glanced toward the corridor wall. "Dusk." She lowered her voice slightly. "They were found together inside an abandoned camper van on the logging road past Brome Ridge. Someone had left them with a bag of food and no water for at least 3 days. When the animal control officer opened the door, Hatch ran straight to her. She paused. Dusk had placed himself between Hatch and the door. He was the one standing guard. The room seemed to narrow by a degree. "They're siblings," Celia continued, "and the shelter is at capacity. If no one takes both of them by tomorrow evening, we'll have to find separate placements. Hatch has 3 families interested." She did not say the rest. She did not need to. Dusk stood by the wall and watched Graham with eyes that held nothing desperate in them. Only that slow, measuring patience, that willingness to wait and see what kind of world this turned out to be. Graham had known men who looked like that. Men who had come home from places no one asked them about and learned to move through ordinary rooms as though every doorway might require a decision. He had seen that look in other people's faces. He had, on occasion and only briefly, seen it in his own. "I don't have dogs," Graham said. No one argued with him. Somehow that made it worse. Outside, the mountains were still hidden. Hatch, released by Graham's departure, sat down in the hallway and watched the door with cheerful certainty, as if entirely confident that this was not, in fact, goodbye. Dusk watched the same door, differently. Graham drove to the grain terminal that night and spent 4 hours doing checks he had already done correctly the first time. His supervisor, a thick-set Newfoundlander named Clem, who had worked the site for 20 years, and kept a bag of peppermints on his desk and an opinion on everything, looked up from the camera monitors when Graham came back through for the 3rd time. "You're lapping yourself, B," Clem said. "Fence lights out on the south side. Was out last week, put it in the report." Graham poured coffee he didn't drink and stood at the window, watching the loading bay lights reflect off puddles on the tarmac. Around 11, his phone buzzed. He had forgotten he'd given Celia his number when Diane asked her to send adoption updates. He looked at the screen. The first photo loaded slowly. Hatch had climbed entirely inside his metal food dish. Both front paws were planted on the rim, his expression one of profound satisfaction. Celia had written beneath it, "He has discovered that everything is funnier from inside a bowl." Graham stared at the photo for longer than was strictly necessary. The sound that escaped him was not quite a laugh, but it moved through him like one and left a trace of warmth behind it. Clem looked over without turning his head. "What's that?" "Nothing." Graham turned the phone face down. "First they send pictures," Clem said, returning to his crossword. "Then you're buying little rain jackets and talking to them in a voice that would shame your grandfather." Graham gave him a look that conveyed his complete disinterest in this line of reasoning. The second photo arrived 4 minutes later. Dusk was curled in the far corner of the kennel on a folded blue mat. His body was drawn inward, muzzle resting between his front paws, but his eyes were open and fixed on the middle distance, on something only he could calculate. He did not look asleep. He looked like a creature who had decided rest was a luxury he hadn't yet earned. Celia's message was brief. He waited for Hatch to eat first, then had 2 bites, then stopped. Then, a few seconds later, "If they separate him tomorrow, I'm not sure he'll recover. I've seen it before." Graham read the message once, then again. He set the phone face down on the desk and walked the south perimeter for 40 minutes in the cold, not because it needed walking, but because standing still had become temporarily impossible. He thought about Dusk's positioning in the corridor, near the wall, facing the exit, between his brother and whatever came through the door. He had seen that before. In men who laughed too quietly at mess hall dinners. In the particular way certain people sat in restaurants with their backs to no one, in the silence that followed when someone asked about deployment and received a technically true answer. He thought about Ajax. He tried not to. Ajax had been a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois with a lean, deliberate body, a black mask, and the ability to read a room faster than any person Graham had ever met. He had been Graham's dog in the way people meant when they said that, which was not ownership precisely, but something closer to mutual custody of each other's safety. Ajax had found the device the unit hadn't seen, on a road in a country Graham no longer named in conversation, on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was bad and everyone was tired. He had saved 6 men. He had not come home. Graham had folded that loss into the same locked place where he kept everything else that had no proper home, and he had called the silence inside it discipline. He stood under the awning at Bay 6 for a long time, with his collar up against the night air, watching the mountains he couldn't see. Then he drove to the shelter the next morning without sleeping first. Celia was already there when he arrived, her dark hair tucked under a collar, sleeves pushed to the elbow, a tiredness around her eyes that suggested she had checked on Dusk more than once overnight. She did not look surprised when she saw him come through the door. She did not say, "I knew you'd come back." She only said quietly, "Morning," and went to get the paperwork. Hatch came skidding across the lobby floor before Graham had taken 3 steps and hit his boot with the force of a creature who had never once in his life considered the concept of restraint. Graham looked down at him. Hatch wagged so hard, his whole back half became a single continuous motion. Then Dusk appeared in the kennel doorway. He did not run. He stood, reading the room the way he always did. Exit, gate, stranger. Then he looked at Graham with those amber eyes, and something in his posture shifted by a degree so small it might have meant nothing. He took 1 step forward, stopped, took another. Graham crouched slowly. Hatch immediately climbed his knee. Dusk stopped 3 feet away, trembling faintly, and did not come closer, but he did not retreat either. Graham understood the distance. He had lived inside it himself for 18 months. He signed 4 pages without reading them carefully, which he never did with anything, and that fact alone told him something important about where he had arrived. The weeks that followed rearranged the cabin in ways Graham had not anticipated. Hatch took to the space with the confidence of someone who believed every room had been prepared in his honor. He declared war on a rubber boot mat, carried a dish towel to locations throughout the house with no discernible purpose, and on one memorable Tuesday barked furiously at a pine cone that had fallen against the back step, then sat beside it as though he had personally neutralized the threat. Dusk grew differently. He moved along walls at first, chose corners where he could see every entrance at once, and ate only when Hatch had started eating. But he was also watching Graham with a steadiness that felt less like fear, and more like someone checking their work, confirming, slowly, that the calculations still added up. Between them, something was taking root. It was not the bright, performative trust Hatch offered at full volume every morning. It was quieter, slower, and shaped like patience. Sometimes Graham would sit on the floor with his back against the kitchen cabinet, the position Celia had recommended, low and unthreatening, and Dusk would drift close enough that the warmth of him was just barely present at the edge of Graham's knee. Not touching. Almost. Graham understood the dignity of almost. It was on the 3rd week, during the first real cold snap of November, that Dusk led him to the garage. Graham had been in the kitchen at 11 at night when he noticed the puppy was gone from the living room. Hatch was asleep near the wood stove in the sprawled, boneless way of a creature who had exhausted himself completely and required no further effort from the world. Dusk was not there. Graham found him in the narrow hallway outside the interior garage door, not scratching, not whimpering, just sitting in front of it with the same deliberate stillness he had shown outside the kennel gate, patient, present, as if he had been placed there by some authority Graham hadn't been consulted about. Graham stood in the hallway for a long moment. "That's not a room," he said quietly. Dusk looked at him, then at the door, then back at him. Graham had not opened that door in 7 months. He had walked past it several hundred times. He had done the thing people sometimes did with difficult rooms, which was to stop seeing them by looking at them long enough without ever opening them. He reached for the handle. The garage still smelled of the particular combination of things that had been Rebecca's domain: garden soil, linseed oil, the lavender sachets she hung from the tool rack. Her wheelbarrow stood in the corner with dried mud still on the wheel. Her seed catalogs were stacked on the workbench. Her winter boots, the green ones she'd bought on their trip to Tofino 4 years ago, sat side by side beneath the shelf. In the back corner was a wooden storage box with a brass latch. Graham had put it there after Ajax. He crossed the garage, sat down on the cold concrete floor, opened the latch. Inside were the things that had no proper name but required a container anyway. A folded citation, a challenge coin, a photograph of younger men with the kind of smiles that came from surviving something together. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, Ajax's working collar. The ID plate still read his name in the simple stamped lettering of military-issue equipment. Graham picked it up. The leather had held its shape. Dusk padded in from the hallway and lay down against Graham's knee. Not draped across his lap, not asking for anything, just there, one small warm weight pressed quietly beside him. Graham did not stop the tears from coming. He bowed his head over the collar and let them arrive with the ungraceful relief of someone who had been holding something too heavy for too long and had only now, finally, found a place to set it down. His shoulders moved once, then again, like a man trying not to break somewhere people could see him, forgetting for a moment that there was no one left to perform strength for. He sat on the cold garage floor for a long time with one hand on Ajax's collar, and the other resting on the darker puppy who had somehow known which door to wait beside. He had kept that grief locked in the same room as Rebecca's green boots and her seed catalogs. He saw that now. He had needed both losses to be adjacent, contained, not contaminating everything else, and instead the containment had been contaminating him, slowly, the way cold gets into a house through a door that was never properly sealed. Dusk stayed. Outside, the night moved through the fir trees. Inside, Hatch snored near the wood stove, unaware that something had shifted in the room at the end of the hallway that would change the shape of the whole house. The storm came in mid-December, the kind that dropped a foot of snow overnight and turned the sea-to-sky corridor white and still and unrecognizable. Hatch found it immediately compelling. He had never seen snow in volume and approached it with the same methodology he applied to everything. Full commitment, zero planning. Graham had stepped out to latch the side gate when Hatch found the gap under the fence. He was gone before Graham heard the change in sound. One bark, bright, celebratory, rapidly receding into the tree line. Graham shouted his name into the dark. The snow took the sound apart. He expected Dusk to freeze in the doorway. The cautious one. The one who read every room before entering. The one who had spent 3 days guarding a door in an abandoned van instead of running through it. Dusk did not freeze. He moved past Graham into the snow at a speed Graham had never seen from him. Head low, body driving, not chasing the dark or the trees, but chasing the direction his brother had gone, with a precision that looked less like instinct and more like decision. Graham ran after both of them into the forest. He found them 40 minutes later near the creek embankment, sheltered partly by a fallen cedar. Hatch had run himself into exhaustion, and the cold, his black and tan coat packed with snow, his bright eyes dimmed with something very far from his usual confidence. Dusk was pressed against his outside, curved around him, his own darker back turned fully into the wind, absorbing it, holding it off his brother. His fur was matted with snow. His body was trembling, his eyes were open. Graham made a sound that was not a word, and gathered them both against his chest. He stood in the dark forest with 2 cold dogs held against him and understood, with a force that surprised him with its clarity, that the frightened one in his house had been the brave one in the world when it counted. Dusk had not stopped being afraid. He had simply decided that something else mattered more than the fear, and had moved toward it anyway, into the dark, into the storm, without hesitation. Graham had known men who operated exactly that way. He had been one once. He had stopped believing he still was. Both dogs recovered. Hatch with characteristic speed and total lack of appropriate humility, wrapped in a blanket for one afternoon, then immediately attempting to steal it from Dusk's bed the following morning. Dusk more slowly, sleeping longer, moving carefully but steadying. On the 4th evening after the storm, while Hatch snored near the wood stove and snow settled quietly outside, Dusk rose from his blanket, crossed the room with unhurried certainty, and rested his head on Graham's knee. Graham went very still. Hatch startled awake from across the room, assessed the situation, and attempted to climb Graham's other knee from the opposite side. He miscalculated the geometry entirely and fell backward into the laundry basket. The sound Graham made was full and unguarded, rough at the edges like something long kept in a cold room, but it was real. It moved through the whole cabin. Dusk did not lift his head. He stayed, calm and certain, as if resting there had always been the plan. Celia had been coming by since the storm to check on the dogs. And then, as January moved toward February, for reasons that required progressively thinner professional justification. She had the steady, unpretentious quality Graham had noticed at the shelter. She did not perform calm, she simply had it. She brought food recommendations and ear-cleaning instructions, and on one gray afternoon, coffee from the place on Cleveland Avenue, and then sat at his kitchen table and listened while he told her about Ajax. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Maybe Dusk knew which door needed someone to wait beside it, she said. Graham looked at the hallway. The garage door stood open now. Not wide, but open. He's a dog, he said. They know more than we give them credit for. From the living room, Hatch ran directly into the side of the sofa, recovered, and continued forward with total commitment. Celia glanced toward him, some more than others. Graham laughed again. It was getting easier. That frightened him less each time. In February, Diane arrived on a Sunday, carrying a flyer and wearing the particular expression of a woman who has absolutely prepared this moment, but intends to present it as spontaneous. She placed the flyer on the kitchen table and sat down across from Graham. The Squamish Legion is hosting a fundraiser for the Rescue Society, she said. They need people to bring dogs. Graham looked at the flyer, then at Diane, then at the dogs. No. Diane folded her hands on the table. I haven't finished asking. I heard the shape of it. She did not move. Diane Miller, Diane Telfer. She still used their family name when he needed reminding, had once argued him into attending her university convocation by pointing out that his absence would be noticed by exactly the people whose opinions he claimed not to value. She knew which levers existed and where to find them. It's one afternoon, she said. Hatch will charm everyone in the room. Dusk might surprise you. She paused. Or you might surprise yourself. Dusk walked over from the rug near the wood stove and placed one paw on Graham's boot. Not urgently, steadily. Graham looked down at him for a moment. This, he said, is a conspiracy. Diane smiled. Family tradition. The Legion Hall smelled of wood polish and old wool, and the kind of coffee that had been brewing since, before anyone currently present had arrived. Graham came in with both dogs, Hatch at the end of a lead and absolutely vibrating with the social possibilities of the room, Dusk close at his heel, reading every face, every sound, every corner before committing to anything. Hatch became known to every person in the room within 10 minutes, primarily by stealing a butter tart from an unguarded napkin and then sitting on the evidence with unconvincing innocence. Laughter moved through the room and kept moving, warm and easy. Graham stood near the wall and held the lead, and did not entirely prevent one side of his mouth from doing something against his will. Dusk stayed close. Then he didn't. An old man sat alone near the window at the back of the hall. Vernon Quillen was 81 years old, a Korean War veteran, slight and precise in a flannel shirt and suspenders with his white hair combed carefully back. His hands, folded on his knees, shook slightly with age and something older than age. He watched the room with the eyes of someone who was present in body, and at the same time, not entirely here. No one was talking to him. Dusk slipped the end of his lead. He crossed the hall at a slow, deliberate walk. Not the hesitant wall following of his early weeks, but a calm, purposeful crossing of open ground. He reached Vernon's chair and lay down beside it, close enough that the warmth of him was present, far enough to make no demand of any kind. Vernon looked down at the dog for a long moment, his trembling hand lowered slowly to the top of Dusk's head. The room did not go silent all at once. It softened the way a crowd softens when it senses something it does not want to interrupt, something that belongs to two people and should not be crowded. Had a dog like you once, Vernon said. His voice was thin and precise, long time ago. Dusk closed his eyes beneath the old man's hand and stayed. Graham stood across the hall, with his chest open and his throat tight, and understood, in that moment, something he had been circling for months without landing on. Pain did not dissolve because it was stored properly. It waited, it condensed, it grew heavier in direct proportion to how long a person refused to let anyone near it. And sometimes, not always but sometimes, something quiet and patient and warm enough simply lay down beside it and gave it permission to breathe. He looked at Celia, who was watching him from near the donation table, with an expression that was not pity, and not triumph, and not anything he had a precise name for, which was the most honest kind of response he knew. He looked at Diane, who was pretending to study a pamphlet about pet adoption and doing it very badly. He looked at Hatch, who had located a second potential butter tart situation and was conducting diplomatic negotiations with a patient veteran in a Legion cap, and at Dusk, lying quietly beside an old man's chair, as though he had always known, from the very first morning in the shelter corridor, that this particular spot in this particular room was precisely where he was supposed to arrive. Spring returned to Squamish the way it always did, without asking permission, without announcement, simply sliding back into the valley and making itself at home. The snow left the ridge in stages. The creek below the cabin ran high and fast with melt. The Douglas firs lifted their branches toward warmer light and held it differently. Graham sat on his front porch one April evening, with coffee going cold in his hand and 2 dogs at his feet. Hatch was asleep on his side with his legs extended and his mouth slightly open, having decisively defeated the afternoon. Dusk lay across Graham's boots, with one ear turned toward the tree line, listening to whatever the forest was doing. Celia sat in the other porch chair, her shoulder almost touching his. Diane was inside, nominally making dinner, audibly reorganizing the kitchen in ways that would not be discovered for several days. Graham watched the ridge where the last light was going amber and gold. He did not measure the exits. He noticed that he wasn't, and he let the noticing simply sit there. "I used to think the point was not to need anything," he said eventually. Celia turned toward him but did not speak. Graham rubbed one hand over Dusk's back, kept the house clean, kept the schedule, called it peace. He was quiet for a moment. "Turns out I was just doing a very convincing impression of someone who was fine." "And now?" Celia asked. From inside the house, Hatch startled awake, barked once at what was almost certainly a cloud, reassessed the situation with great seriousness, and went back to sleep. Graham looked at him. Something in his chest, something that had been held in a very particular configuration for a very long time, shifted into a slightly different arrangement. Not broken, not fixed, but different. More like itself. "Now," he said, "the quiet doesn't get much of a say anymore." Celia smiled. From inside, Diane called something about a casserole that was only partly about the casserole. Graham looked at the mountain going dark above the tree line, at the porch light beginning to make itself useful, at the 2 dogs who had walked into his cabin on a cold November afternoon, and made an irreversible argument for the value of staying present in one's own life. He had driven his sister to the shelter on a gray Thursday morning because she needed a favor, and because saying yes to Diane was always the path of least resistance. He had stood near the entrance with his hands in his pockets and told himself he was not planning to look at the dogs. He thought about Dusk standing guard in the cold doorway of an abandoned van on a logging road. He thought about Ajax doing the same thing on a different road in a different country for the same reason. He thought about Vernon's trembling hand lowering to a dark head that offered nothing but presence, which turned out, as it always did, to be exactly enough. He thought about the garage door standing open now, Rebecca's green boots visible from the hallway, and the way grief didn't need to be stored so much as it needed, eventually, to be witnessed. It had taken an 8-week-old dog with amber eyes, and the patience of something much older, to show him which door had needed opening all along. He had brought 2 puppies home from a shelter, that much was simply true, but somewhere between a cold garage floor, a blizzard in the dark, and an old man's trembling hand at the back of a Legion hall, those 2 puppies had quietly, patiently, stubbornly begun bringing him back to himself. Graham Telfer had spent years believing that making it through each day intact was the highest thing available to a man who had already lost what made the days worth getting through. Hatch and Dusk had arrived muddy-pawed and entirely certain of themselves and made a different argument, not in words, not in grand gestures, but in the small, daily, undeniable language of creatures who stay, who wait outside locked doors, who run into storms for the ones they love, who lie down beside grief without asking it to justify itself first. He had not gone to the shelter looking for anything. He had found 2 dogs and, somewhere between all of it, found his way back to his own life. Dusk sighed against his boots. The porch light held against the coming dark. And above the tree line, the mountains finally showed themselves, clear and close, and very much still there, the way things that had always been present sometimes appeared, once a person stopped trying quite so hard not to see them.